the right cyst started growing so fast. It was 10 centimeters in September of 2021. It started growing so fast that when I went back in to go see her, she booked me for surgery in December of 2021. And at the time of removing it, it had grown to 15 centimeters. I felt like it was growing like a pregnancy. I was recovering at a rehab hospital because I needed the extra care they could give there for the degree of the surgery. And I got another call from the doctor, the surgeon, who notified me that.
Julie, how did you find Carnivore?
So it's a bit of a long story. I've been doing low carb eating since about 2012. And I've had, I started on that initially to help with chronic fatigue that was becoming more and more severe over time. It's been a mystery to me since my teens. And I went to school partly in trying to solve my own health problems for nutrition. I didn't find the answers I was looking for there. And then, eventually it was a doctor who suggested try low carb. And if it doesn't work, we'll see what to do next. So I think I'll just give a little quick history of the different health issues I've faced, because I find for me one of the challenges in like attempting to help my issues is just the long-termness of everything, despite everything I've tried. And yet I do find that the different dietary protocols that I've employed have really helped. So just to give everybody an idea of the health issues I've been dealing with, I was born with cerebral palsy, which is a congenital neuromuscular disorder. There's different kinds of cerebral palsy, but the one that I live with is called spastic diplegia. So that means that it does affect my whole body, but it affects my lower limbs more than my upper limbs. And typically it affects my balance, my coordination, and my muscle stiffness. So I typically, I grew up walking with canes. And then later on, I used a mobility scooter for longer distances. And probably since I was 30, I started using a wheelchair inside as well. Mostly because wear and tear on the body is pretty tricky when you walk the way I do. And so that kind of saved my back. So that's been lifelong for me. And then probably in my teens is when I started noticing chronic fatigue. That just at the time it was periods of a couple of weeks at a time of increasing fatigue that would become severe, and then I'd have a bit of a break from it. But slowly the periods of fatigue increased and the amount of fatigue increased. And it was something that my mom has also dealt with. So I was already noticing that my fatigue patterns were sort of imitating hers. And we were both trying to troubleshoot even back then to see, would it help if we took a certain supplement or if we took out sugar. And I don't ever remember any one particular thing helping with it. And I would say generally I had what I thought was a pretty healthy diet. Then so I'm 47 now. In 1997, I started a nutrition degree at the university here. And I was studying nutrition between 1997 and 2002. And I've actually included a picture of Canada's food guide at the time. It's very similar in the recommendations to America's food pyramid, but at that time it was a rainbow. And basically, so I mean, we learned a ton of biology, chemistry, physiology, and all of that was actually really, really helpful to understand the makeup of the human body and how different, like the molecules that different foods were made up of and how they were broken down in the body. But then I found it really confusing when that started to come down to what recommendations were being made. And just for a couple of examples, I remember in Canada's food guide, it seemed odd to me that there were only 2 to 3 servings of meat and alternatives, and that it was just 2 to 3 servings a day, the size of about a deck of cards. And yet the grains and cereals, one of the 4 food groups that apparently you couldn't do without, was 6 to 12 servings, where, for example, 1 serving was considered 1 piece of bread. And I remember thinking that for a woman of my size, like I couldn't even imagine if I were to eat like a sandwich for lunch and a sandwich for dinner and a sandwich for breakfast, just to think about how many servings that is. Like that's 6 if that's all I ate. But I don't know, to try to get 6 to 12 servings just seemed excessive. And then recommendations like cholesterol was a big thing then. And we were told, don't eat more than 2 eggs a week because they have cholesterol, and you don't want, like, you can have 1 or 2, but don't do that otherwise, or you could end up with a heart attack from the cholesterol. So, and butter was, at that time they were saying, we're not really sure whether butter is better than margarine. The research is kind of split on that. And I just remember thinking, like, meat and butter and eggs are such a natural thing that we've eaten for centuries. So all of the actual food recommendations weren't always making sense to me. But I did love what I was learning in the chemistry, biology, biochem, all of that. And I think that really helped me on my own journey to troubleshoot my own chronic fatigue, especially. So every once in a while, I would go to my doctors with something that I found. And for example, one year after I'd finished the nutrition degree, I went to him and I said, I have a friend who has a different disability, but it is neuromuscular, and she really benefited when she was younger by drinking Ensure every day. Could we look at doing that? And I'll drink 1 can of it every day for a year. And so we did some paperwork so I could get some coverage for that. But a year later, I had to admit, and I was thinking, because there's a lot of vitamins that are listed in there as well. I was aware that it was sweet, but again, we were taught, and I really followed the low fat recommendations. I really bought into that. And so I wasn't too concerned about the sugar levels in Ensure as I am now, but typically it's given to people who don't have enough, aren't getting enough calories or enough protein. So anyway, it was about 2012 when I went to a doctor for a different reason, and he he mentioned that he specialized in pain and fatigue. So right away I asked him, can I come back for the fatigue? Because my doctor had never been able to give me suggestions on how to help my fatigue. So when I went back to this doctor, he had first said, try going gluten and dairy free for a month strictly. And if that doesn't work, then we'll try low carb. And that was the first time, even with a full nutrition degree, that was the first time that I'd ever heard gluten or dairy related to chronic fatigue. And I knew, and that was way before most of the public even knew what gluten was. I did, because it was brought up in the context of wheat sensitivity and celiac disease, but it wasn't related to any other chronic conditions that I remember. And the recommendations I remember being taught were celiac disease is rare. These are the symptoms that show up in childhood. Don't overdiagnose, and you don't want to over restrict anybody's diet, or they will end up being deficient in nutrients that they would otherwise get from the foods that you might suggest eliminating. So those were the recommendations I remember being drilled into us. And so I was really curious when that doctor had suggested cutting gluten and dairy, but I was already experiencing so much fatigue that I was ready to do anything he said. And it intrigued me that he was actually giving me dietary advice. And I think he also sent me home with homework to read a book. And I don't remember what the first book was, but this doctor, I was so impressed. The first book he asked me to read was something to do with hormones. And it gave the recommendation to cut all sugar, alcohol, and two other things, which I don't remember. Coffee, I think, and one other one. Most of those I was already doing, but the sugar I got strict with, and that was before the gluten and dairy. So after he recommended to cut the gluten and dairy, that got me started on my own dietary research for chronic fatigue. And so it wasn't too long after that that I started finding information. Like, I remember finding 50% of the people that have a gluten sensitivity have the same reaction to dairy. So that made sense of the dairy recommendation. And then I was waiting to start to feel better, and weeks were going by, and I actually felt worse for the first 6 weeks after giving up gluten and dairy. Later on, I learned that can be the body's reaction to having your gut biome change. So the microbes in there that are dying off because they're not being fed anymore are creating more of the same symptoms. So after about 6 weeks, and I was super strict with it, the fatigue lightened a bit, but not more than before I cut out the gluten and dairy. It was just back up to my normal level. And in those 6 weeks, I was probably sleeping or lying down most of the day. I wasn't up and moving except to make my meals. So I was relieved when that lightened up again, but then I was back at my old level. And the one thing that happened that made me believe that it was doing something and motivated me to keep going was that I had chronic adult acne, like since my teens, that had never gone away. And a lot of the symptoms that I was having were like just short of actually going to a doctor. I was always pretty slow to go to a doctor for symptoms because I tried my best to, and I wasn't terribly bothered by the acne, but the fact I was always aware that it was there, and I think it was kind of getting more severe. Like I was finding pimples in different areas, and so anyway, that cleared up after 2 weeks. So even though my fatigue was worse, my face was clearer than it had been in years. And it surprised me because I wasn't even looking for that, right? So, so that was my clue that I don't know what is happening, but something is happening. And then everything else that I was researching, again, with my nutrition background, there were things that I could read and understand the physiology of what was happening. So at that point, I was reading like some people who have that sensitivity to gluten also have the same to dairy. Then I found they can also have the same to soy and the same to corn. So I used to like making myself a big bowl of popcorn as a yummy snack, and I was still on the low fat wagon. So I wouldn't put butter on, but I'd sprinkle lots of salt, and that was just a real treat for me, right? And so as soon as I saw corn was on the list of things that could be creating whatever my reaction was, then I also I cut the soy, I cut the popcorn or any corn, and then as the weeks kept going and I wasn't noticing more difference with the fatigue, then as I kept researching, I kept cutting different things. So the next thing I saw, and most of this advice was coming from like a properly qualified doctor, or a presentation that was made to doctors. So I trusted that more than just somebody saying, "Hey, this is what I did." Anyway, so I ended up after that finding somebody who said, "Oh, and sometimes people who have this reaction will have to cut all grains." And because of my nutrition experience, like we would have to create different menus for people with different sensitivities. So it was easy for me to say, okay, if I'm not going to have grains, then I can just substitute some beans and lentils in instead of that. And then again, waiting for the fatigue to lift, and it wasn't budging. I found another person that said, well, and some people have to give up all beans and lentils. And that's where I was like, well, what are you supposed to eat then, right? So, but it was very shortly after that a friend of mine had mentioned, have you heard of the GAPS protocol? Which I hadn't, but GAPS stands for gut and psychology syndrome, or gut and physiology syndrome. And the author of those two books is Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride. And she's a neurologist who I think has a postgrad in nutrition. And she came up with this protocol, and I think it's based on the specific carbohydrate diet for anybody who might have heard of that. But then she incorporated certain things from her Russian background that she also knew about. And basically, it's a protocol that it's a type of elimination diet. It focuses mostly on well-cooked meats and vegetables, and incorporates a lot of homemade probiotics. and there's no grains and starches and absolutely no processed foods. So she lists out all the GAPS friendly foods and the ones to avoid. So, and again, because of my nutrition background, it's a pretty thick book, and most of it is the scientific explanation of why it works for different conditions. But I found it quite easy to understand. And by the end of reading that book, I remember thinking, wow, this really makes sense, And it followed all of the research I had done so far. It was basically saying, take out all the grains and starches that I had already found, and then here's the way to rebuild, to reintroduce foods one at a time or a few at a time. So the GAPS protocol is the introduction diet is 6 different stages, and it starts with the most digestible, most gut healing foods, and it can be completely carnivore. It can be ketogenic, but the upper stages add in more foods that would make it not ketogenic. But there's a reason why certain foods are included and others aren't. And then she also has a way, she describes ways that you can test on your skin whether you would react to a food by ingesting. So before trying a new food, she describes a way to test that on your skin, and then just introduce things in small amounts. So it made a lot of sense. And she described a bunch of conditions that could be helped by the GAPS protocol. And she said that on average, a lot of the conditions that she described or said this could be helpful for, in a younger child especially, would heal within about 2 years. But then more chronic conditions or more severe cases would take longer. And I do remember in one of her talks, hearing her say that chronic fatigue is one of the hardest to treat and takes the longest. So at that time, I remember thinking, I'm ready to go strict with this. And I had a feeling that if it was going to work the way I hoped it would, that it would likely take me at least 4 years. So I was ready to do 4 years on GAPS. And it's kind of funny now because I remember in the earlier months thinking, oh, when I get to the end of the 4 years, I'm going to have the biggest slice of chocolate cake. And then as I got into it and I was feeling really good, like the fatigue was still there, but other things were starting to heal. I'm like, why would I eat the chocolate cake? Like I didn't even want to anymore, which is great. So I ended up, I started making all my own, some fermented vegetables. I made some of my own yogurt and sour cream. Sour cream was like my new ice cream, right? But hers, it had to be made in a specific way so that you ferment it for 24 hours. So it would use up all the lactose. But I found when I introduced either the yogurt or the sour cream, I would get a couple of pimples on my face. And I don't have an issue with the pimples themselves, but for me, that has always been my first clue that this is not working for you, because that was the first thing that went away when I cut out the gluten and dairy. And it's usually the first thing to come back if I'm eating something that's not agreeing with me. So doing that and following the stages, I stayed on somewhere between stage 2 and stage 3, which meant that I was doing that for about a year and a half, which for me, that meant I was doing well-cooked soups for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and they were just meat and vegetables. So slow-cooked meats and vegetables, making up the soups, non-starchy ones, of course, the GAPS-friendly ones. And then after 1.5 years, then like I would try like a raw vegetable every once in a while. But part of my digestive issues was just that I realized after I started GAPS that I had a whole list of digestive issues that I hadn't even recognized. So some of those were, I realized I've always had, my stools were always looser than they really should be. It didn't end up being physically a problem, but not having that, I realized it's probably because things aren't digesting properly, and that could be affecting my fatigue. So every time when I was eating the soups, and then I would try a raw vegetable, which is it's a higher stage, right? So she goes from the well-cooked ones to the soft raw vegetables, and then the crunchier vegetables, because the crunchier ones and even the softer but raw, will scratch your kind of scrape your digestive system on its way through. So if it's sensitive for any reason, or there's healing that needs to take place, that's gonna slow the healing. So I was doing soups for about a year and a half, and then I could finally move up the stages to soft raw vegetables. I still remember the first time I made, she always says start with a bite or two of a new food before you do more, but it was summer and I was craving it so bad. I made a big kind of Greek style cucumbers, tomatoes, and it went down. It didn't give me any digestive issues, so I was so excited. That was the summer, a year and a half later, that I could start doing that. And then slowly I would introduce other foods that were on the upper stages of the GAPS protocol. And all this time I noticed I was digesting the food better. And in all that time, then so the acne had disappeared, and that stayed that way as long as I didn't introduce too much. On the upper stages was like more nuts and seeds and fruits and things. And she does say to you're not supposed to go overboard with them if you're trying to heal yourself, right? So what I would notice is when I would have a fatigue crash, where the fatigue kind of goes in, I can crash for a few days, and then meaning I need to rest much more of the day, not do much activity. My muscles will ache, my brain will be foggy, all those things. And I noticed that when I would do that, and then I wouldn't have as much energy even to warm up my food, or if I ran out of soup, then I would go for the more snacky GAPS friendly foods, which would include more of the nuts and seeds and fruits, or like raisins, things that were filling but easy to grab. And then I would notice I would have more of the digestive issues. So okay, back to the soups. So that I was doing the GAPS protocol for about 3.5 years, but still the fatigue wasn't budging. But I used to have pretty severe menstrual cramps, and I think it was at about 9 months on the protocol, that started decreasing. And I would get migraines once or twice a month. And they were the kind of migraines that would come with vertigo and nausea. And if I had a migraine, I called that my force quit button. It was the one thing I could not push through. It meant that I had to take ibuprofen and caffeine and go to sleep and stay there, lights out, no sound. So, and then they would last like 1 to 2 days. So they were increasing, but after I started GAPS, they were slowly decreasing in severity and how often I was getting them. Till 3.5 years later, I barely had any menstrual cramps anymore. And like, I definitely didn't have to take any painkillers. And previously I had to take painkillers pretty consistently, like every 4 hours for the first 2 days. Yeah, the migraines disappeared. Brain fog, muscle aches, the digestive issues were, so one of the things that I've experienced since I was a child, and part of this could also be exaggerated by cerebral palsy, is a reflux that wouldn't burn, but I would actually bring up food in my mouth multiple times after every meal. And it was so normal for me that I just got used to making it not obvious. And I didn't even always realize that it was happening. But after I started GAPS, and then I started realizing, oh, I've got this digestive issue and that digestive issue. I started, when I was making those soups, I started making smaller portions, like like half a bowl of soup, not a lot at all, and seeing if that would disappear. And it took a couple weeks, but then I did notice like the small portions were working and that had disappeared. And then I could handle a bit of a larger portion. And so on the soup stages, that had disappeared. And that's another thing that every once in a while, if I was having more of the nuts and seeds and fruits, that would reappear. And then that was another clue that, okay, you got to back up and stay on those earlier stages. So after about 3.5 years of following that, like a lot of physical symptoms had resolved, but not the chronic fatigue. And I don't think it had even improved. And it was a mystery to me, because now I'm getting closer to the 4 years that I was thinking this is what it'll take. And I think I was taking a few supplements as well, cod liver oil and a probiotic that Dr. Natasha had recommended. And I had at that time in my research, I'd also found an anti-cancer protocol called the Gerson protocol. And it was even stricter than GAPS, but it focused a lot on juicing and juicing specific vegetables. So it was similar to the GAPS diet in that it had a list of okay vegetables and a list of not okay vegetables and foods, and you had to be 100% strict with it to work. But it was something that some people were using and finding success to reverse cancer with, or other really severe health issues. So I thought, there was a full Gerson protocol and then a modified Gerson protocol. So I looked at the Gerson protocol, the modified one, because I thought there's no way I could do the amount of juicing that was required for the full one, but maybe with my fatigue, I could handle the modified. So I gave it 2 weeks of trying the modified one. And interestingly, I remember my skin becoming even softer. So, and even noticing the skin on my hands. And since skin was the first thing that had cleared up when I started GAPS. I thought, I think it's doing something, but at the end of the 2 weeks, I was spending the entire day just on food prep and juicing and everything involved in that. And again, the fatigue hadn't budged. So I thought, I can't. At that time, I thought if I were to even notice a slight improvement with the fatigue, I would keep doing it, because at some point the balance will tip and it'll be easier to do and more manageable. But at the end of 2 weeks, I couldn't keep it up because it was all I did every day. So, and then I think that was in September that I tried those 2 weeks of 2015. And in December, I was pretty shocked to get a stage 3 breast cancer diagnosis. So that was, I mean, it was shocking to say the least, but it was also really puzzling because the science behind the GAPS protocol it's a very cancer preventative diet, right? Or it's actually meant to be not a lifelong diet, although for some people it is recommended to, but it's meant to heal and seal your gut, and then you can transition onto a healthy whole foods diet. Following principles of Weston A. Price Foundation, where you're only eating foods that are properly prepared, that kind of thing. So anyway, the breast cancer diagnosis was shocking, but the one good thing about having tried the Gerson diet was I was really afraid of what chemo would do. Given my cerebral palsy, the neuromuscular aspect of it, and we can sometimes overreact to medications. So I was really torn with what to do with that. I did end up doing the chemo because in the end, I felt that was the best choice in that situation. And at the time, I was also reading benefits of a vegetarian diet for cancer. And I was really confused, right? Like, so everything that made sense previously, I was really confused at that point, and there wasn't time to figure anything out. So during the treatments, which was surgery first, then chemo, and then radiation, I followed. So I was keeping a lot of the things from the GAPS protocol, but I was introducing more some green and red lentils, which are, I think they're either on the sixth stage of the GAPS protocol, but I also knew they're 50% protein and 50% starch. So keep it to a minimum. And then I was cutting out meats, but I was eating eggs. And then I was cooking all the vegetables really well, drinking the broth, all of like those kinds of principles from the GAPS protocol. I kept up, and I still wonder whether doing that actually helped me deal with some of the treatments. But after I finished those, I was really hopeful that getting through that and then going back to GAPS, or then I would finally be able to get over the fatigue. But then I was asked to, it was recommended to take tamoxifen, an anti-estrogen medication, which blocks the cells in the body from uptaking estrogen, because my particular cancer was it was triggered to grow by estrogen. So by taking this, statistically, it was shown to decrease the chance of recurrence by 50%. And at the time of my treatments, I was still at a pretty high risk of recurrence. So I hated the thought of taking the medication, knowing what I know about gaps and hormones. And I thought the chemo and everything is going to reverse all the work I did on my gut and all the gut healing. And taking this drug is not going to help it heal, but it could be what saves my life if it's statistically known to decrease the recurrence by 50%. So I took it every day, and every night I would have to remind myself, take your pills, Julie, it might save your life. And I was supposed to take it for 5 years. And what ended up happening during that time was one of the side effects is fatigue. And for a lot of women taking it, the fatigue and other symptoms are still manageable, right? So it's a small cost for a lifetime benefit, hopefully. But for me, what it ended up doing was slowly making the fatigue worse and worse until I was never able to pick up the tutoring that I did before my diagnosis. And I had to give up a part-time bookkeeping job that it was very part-time. But I had to give that up 2 years later because I was noticing I was making mistakes that I wasn't catching even with triple checking my work. And you can't do that with bookkeeping. I was calculating other people's payroll. And so anyway, and then it was affecting my breathing. It was causing muscle aches and bone aches. And I was still so motivated to stay on it because of the high risk of recurrence for me that I thought, if this costs me 5 years of my life, but I get the rest of my life afterwards, I'll do it. And then it wasn't until 4 years and 8 months later, I started getting migraines every other day, and they were lasting two days. And that's when I finally called my doctor and said, well, I finally realized, like, Julie, if you knew a friend of yours was this sick, wouldn't you tell them to get off the medication? So I did. And again, I thought, hopefully this will be it. After I get off the medication, I can like go really hardcore and research and get over the fatigue. And at that point, a cyst, an ovarian cyst that had been monitored every 6 months, they found it at the time. Well, they found a cyst on each side at the time that I went for my initial breast cancer scans. They do a whole body scan to make sure nothing's spread. So we'd been monitoring them every 6 months. And after I got off tamoxifen, the right cyst started growing so fast. It was 10 centimeters in September of 2021. And I could see and feel it growing every week after that. So when I'd gone for my appointment in September, I finally told the oncologist who was monitoring me, okay, I'm ready to do surgery now. She had said previously, if it starts giving you problems, we can do surgery. But I would always say, I'm way too tired. I can't handle surgery. And if it's just a cyst, I'll deal with it. So it started growing so fast that when I went back in to go see her, she booked me for surgery in December of 2021. And at the time of removing it, it had grown to 15 centimeters. I felt like it was growing like a pregnancy. So, and then again, I was thinking maybe this will be the end of my fatigue. It'll be the hardest recovery I've done. But if this is what's causing it now, then it's out and we're good. And then 4 weeks into my recovery, I was recovering at a rehab hospital because I needed the extra care they could give there for the degree of the surgery. And I got another call from the doctor, the surgeon, who notified me that they had sent it away for tests just because of my history. Neither of us expected cancer, but they found another tumor inside the cyst. And so I was due for another round of, like a bunch of sessions of chemo. So I didn't have a lot of stamina by that point, but I knew from before I wasn't going to agonize over whether or not I should do chemo. So it was just, go through with that, get that done. And then, but again, every time chemo is such a strong chemical, I knew it's going to reverse everything that I've been trying to build up again. And then it was probably January or February of last year that I was finally gaining strength after that chemo. And then just starting to walk again and just go for longer walks. And I slipped, one of my canes slipped on a pebble, and I ended up hitting the ground with such force that I broke my hip. So then this year has just been trying to recover from that. So I've been bedbound again. So at the time that I had, with tamoxifen, I was realizing that I was probably 75% of the time in bed. And that's been pretty much this year as well. I couldn't even be up in my wheelchair for the first few months, except for very short periods of time. So again, it's been hard to rebuild that. And because of the nature of the chronic fatigue, I should say, once I got off tamoxifen and I was researching again, that's when I found, I was on a Facebook group and I found out one of the things that could be going on for me is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is, it's genetic. So that would describe why my mom and I have similar symptoms. It often comes with hypermobile joints, which both of us have. And one of the key symptoms is chronic fatigue, partly because your muscles have to make up for the loose joints, right? So with the CP, I've got a weird combination of tight muscles and loose joints, but that combination and a bunch of other symptoms that they listed, including digestive issues, seems like the most logical explanation. I wasn't able to get a formal diagnosis because when I was referred to the Toronto clinic, they said that some of the things with cerebral palsy overlap with symptoms of EDS, so they wouldn't be able to distinguish. But there's not a known cure. And when I looked at what the nature of that was, soft connective tissue includes your whole digestive system. And so it's more prone to damage and absorption of nutrients and all those kinds of things. So I thought, actually, what I've been doing with the GAPS protocol and staying on the lower stages of it have actually been what I would do if I could choose now. And then because of all the additional challenges this year, I would keep watching different videos, and somewhere in there, like, I started hearing more about carnivore, but I already knew from the GAPS protocol that carnivore is one option with that protocol. She just also recommends like lots of broth and particular cooking methods for the foods, right? So, but hearing more and more people's stories now that there's so many out there, and your channel is one of my favorites to watch because it's just fascinating to see. I heard like two or three other stories of people with EDS who were noticing in like significant differences in their strength and fatigue and even the way that their joints were working. So that really motivated me to, okay, let's try cutting the rest of the vegetables and just see if that can help. And I've done that once before, I don't know, a couple years ago maybe, and I didn't do well with it. I think it may have been that I had a hard time digesting fats, and maybe the added vegetables would allow the fats to digest better. Um, but this time, I gradually decreased the amounts of vegetables, and I've been doing carnivore for a late January, I would say. And again, because of the long history and everything that I'm still working on healing, like my hip is still in recovery, so I'm not sleeping well because I have a hospital bed that I've been in during the day and at night, and it hurts sometimes just to be lying in a specific position that the hospital bed will help with. But the hospital bed can get uncomfortable because I've been there too long. So it's still really affecting my sleep, which obviously is going to roll over into the chronic fatigue. And because I've not been able to be physically active for so long, then pushing myself even gently to increase my strength, although it's happening, it also exhausts me. So I'm still in this stage of having like finding where that baseline is, and just like I've just really had to keep reminding myself, like, just be consistent with everything you're doing, and even in your crashes, try to stay relaxed. Like, I've listened to a lot of people stories of people who have recovered from chronic fatigue, and it's usually a multi faceted approach, right? So they generally say, make sure you're getting a good sleep, make sure you're like, any exercise program is more of a like, it's super gradual and it's not really exercise, it's just increasing your ability to do even daily tasks, and just upping that a little bit. Stay relaxed when you have a crash so that you can reprogram your nervous system to not go into the fight or flight mode. Deal with any difficulties or traumas in your past so that that's not creating a factor, or have the support system that you need to handle those, right? So, and then pacing yourself through the day. So rest preemptively instead of after you've crashed when you have the chance. And I've employed those over the years. And I would say I feel like a great big science experiment. And it's kind of nice to see that others are treating their diet the same way, like carnivore, like different versions of carnivore work for different people. So that's been really encouraging.
You've been on carnivore, I guess, since the end of January
Yep.
to now. Have you noticed any improvements or anything that could indicate that, you're going in the right direction?
Well, interestingly, um, just as when I was trying the Gerson protocol, which is a very, very different one, but I had noticed that my skin had gotten even softer. I noticed the same thing when about a week into doing carnivore, I was like, I'm still not noticing the difference in fatigue. But I did notice that my skin was even smoother than before starting. And the other thing that I remember was there was a few weeks where I have PSWs that come to help me in the morning and the evening with certain things. And I remember telling them a few times, I feel like for the amount of stuff I'm doing, which isn't a lot, but it might be the like 3 medical appointments in a week instead of just one outing, because one outing can really exhaust me. And so anyway, whether it was because I was increasing the amount of time I was walking, I was increasing, I use an elliptical, so I've been able to get onto that to help my hip and legs. And I had said to them a few times over a few weeks, like, I feel like for the amount of things I'm doing, I should be more tired than I am. So I was still very tired, but I usually have a good idea of when I've overdone it and I could likely be headed for a crash. And that wasn't happening. Um, Now, after, like, I think in the last 3 weeks, I have had a bit of a crash, but I think that maybe because I've been fighting a bit of a bug. So the chronic fatigue symptoms are often very similar to when you're getting sick. But then I can even feel sometimes what feels like a mild fever, but then like I can just feel it on my skin, but I'm not actually burning up. So with the chronic fatigue, I can feel like I'm getting sick, but then I don't. So that's just an inflammation response, and that's how it feels. So I can be 2 to 3 weeks into fighting something, and finally, because of a certain symptom, whether it's a bit of a sore throat or runny nose, like it takes something very specific to finally tell me, oh, maybe I'm actually sick. And I have wondered whether that's what's been going on in the last 3 weeks to sort of flatten my progress again. But there was a stretch of a few weeks where I do remember saying, I feel like I'm doing better than I should be.
So, I mean, is your plan to continue this way for the foreseeable future?
If carnivore ends up um, being sustainable for me and like in and continuing to increase my energy levels, then if it really works, I'm happy to stay with it forever. And it's really important for me to at least stay ketogenic and GAPS friendly, because it's also helpful for lymphedema, which I developed in my right arm after having my lymph nodes removed. So I will be definitely staying ketogenic for life. And like I said, if carnivore really works for me, then I'm happy to stay on it forever.
So I wonder if you've been willing to come on a few months from now and maybe do a little bit of an update and talk about if there has been any changes or if you have decided to go in another direction.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be good, especially given the short window of time relative to everything that you have been doing carnivore. It'd be good to see 2, 3 months down the track how things are panning out for you.
Yeah. And I would say, given the progress and the speed of progress, I think even 6 months might be a better measurement. But yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm really curious myself. Like I said, I feel like I'm my own bit of science experiment, and I'm really curious to see how this goes longer term.
So, if people want to reach out to you, do you have a way for them to contact you, Julie?
Yes, I wrote my new email address in an email that I sent to you. Do I have it here? Oh, so I called it neuro.nutrition.nerd@gmail.com.
Nice. Well, I'll link to your email below.
Mm-hmm.
And Julia, really appreciate you taking the time to come on and share your journey with us. Thank you so much.
Oh, and thank you for all the work you do. It's been super helpful for me to hear.